Welcome to the Holistic Health Show, where the worlds of science and spirituality converge to illuminate a path towards total well-being. Join us as we embark on a journey to bridge the gap between Western medicine and complementary therapies, offering you a roadmap to embrace a proactive, holistic approach to your health. It's time to empower yourself with choices that nurture your body, mind, and soul. Welcome to a world of infinite possibilities for your optimal health. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Holistic Health Show. I'm really excited that you are able to join us again today. Today on the show, we have Bram Duffee. Now, Bram, you're joining us from Houston, Texas, and you're a research fellow at, let me get this right, the Institute of Social Innovation. You're a paramedic, and you have a PhD in human development. Now, that's a
Yes.
lot, and I know that you've got a lot of experience, I think over 25 years, so I'd love it if you could kinda lead us from there and tell us more about what you do and why you're on the show today.
Well, like you said, I'm a paramedic and I've been a paramedic for 25 years. And that in itself is kind of a big deal because, here in the US, we have a problem with the burnout rate. And we go through paramedics in like 2 to 4 years. It's kind of like the life expectancy. And I have stuck in here for 25 and I
Yeah.
am still on an ambulance, still in the field. I love my job. I love all this stuff. And so, you know, um, that's my main
That's a big
passion
commitment.
area. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
it's different when you love your job because not everyone gets to say that they love what they do, so much. And what I say is that as long as I am not exhausted, I'm pretty happy, doing what I do. And I'm really happy that you could bring me on the show today because I have so much that's just happened in my life all at one time, and it's just definitely worth talking about.
Right.
I had a journal article come out and a book come out, all this in the same month. And, all of this craziness that I have to talk to you about today is really related to the fact that I've been able to be in the field as a paramedic for a long time and persevere, through that and see that there are things that we can do to make that part of medicine better. And so I have two sides to me. I am a speech teacher, so I teach interpersonal communication and public speaking at the college on one side of my life, and on the other side of my life, I I work on an ambulance. And so, looking at the the it's really hard not to think about both of those things all the time. When I'm in the classroom, I talk about paramedic stuff. When I'm with my patients, I think about the communication stuff. And because I've had like basically like two full careers, in different fields, they've allowed me to help look at what changes we can do and how we talk to each other. And I'm just excited to be able to talk about it.
Yeah, it's exciting to have you on the show, and what I found quite interesting is, as you know, I was a paramedic kind of in a past life. It feels like a long time ago now, but like yourself, I really loved the job. It was very rewarding, and I do miss it a lot at times. And your book, it's called, and I want to get this right, Hypnotic Communication in Emergency Settings for Life-Saving and Therapeutic Outcomes. Now, I'm
Yeah.
wondering if we have a little connection here because, when I would have patients, I'd often think, there's a lot more that this patient could have been doing before they got themselves in this situation. And so it kind of led me to this to explore more holistic viewpoints in healthcare and how people can kind of manage their health with that. So more kind of on the complementary medicine sort of side of that spectrum. And I mean, hypnosis kind of sits over there. So I wonder, how are you integrating hypnosis into or are you actually integrating hypnosis in your paramedic work at the moment? Or how do you see that kind of evolving? And I am throwing a lot of questions at you because I'm just
Yeah.
really, I'm finding this really interesting. But also, how did you come to this? How all of a sudden did you kind of go from paramedicine to thinking, oh, well, hypnosis is going to be really beneficial here?
So, I went through this time where in my academic studies and research, I was always focused on how paramedics can best communicate. So it's sort of this
Mm.
communication column. And I thought that was really important for lots of reasons. One of which is that we need to be able to convince people that what we were saying is true. If you need to go to the hospital, I'm telling you, to go to the hospital,
Uh,
I need you to believe me. So,
mhm.
there's some reasons why, we need to think about, how we communicate. But that was always for my almost my whole academic career. That's been my focus is paramedic communication, interpersonal communication, and researching that when it comes to conflict and those kinds of areas. But I had this person who is a professor and that was part of my PhD program, but never one of my professors. And he and I worked together on this book. And, I always ran from the topic because, the word hypnosis for most people is like a word that's like spooky, voodoo, not real stuff, and
Mm.
most folks are, a lot of the emergency room physicians that I talk to about this topic give me sort of a slant eye, about it because it's just not they don't think it's real necessarily. And what I had lots of skepticism myself. And, as a researcher, I was interested and this this particular person kind of drew me in and pulled me together and as a result, we came together to formulate some awesome stuff in this book. And so I'd like to just tell you about him. My
Yeah.
co-author, his name is Four Arrows. He goes by Don Trent Jacobs. He's an author of over 25 books, and he has two doctorates. One is a PhD in psychology, and then he has a doctorate in education. And he's a hypnotherapist, has been for his whole life, done it a long time. And a really long time ago, he's older now, but a really long time ago, he was an EMT firefighter. And and so for him, what he kind of discovered in his life was that he discovered that the patients that he would encounter as an EMT were a lot of times in a hypnotic trance, just like a kind of hypnotic trance that someone that he would spend a really long time going through a process to bring them into a hypnotic trance as a hypnotherapist. And it's really kind of like wild that in his case too, it took him being an expert in two different fields for him to be able to
Mm.
put all this together, like he's a psychologist who, a hypnotherapist who does EMT work. And so it's just for him, there wasn't much aha moment. He just saw it. And so before him and before us even, there were people talking about how the fear, the overwhelming emotion that goes with having a life-threatening emergency does really put us highly susceptible will come into a hypnotic trance. And so because of that, it's important that we think about the things that we do around that person, right? So just have, if you have chest pain and you can't breathe, or if your arm just got cut off, right? I'd be exaggerating, but just say something very severe. If those things happen to you, then you are a patient that feels desperate and you reached out, for help, and that the medical person is there to help you. And the everything is set up in everything's set up for the hypnotic trance to just be in place because, we have a real victim who is in fear. And so when that person that arrives in the ambulance, they have an opportunity to really help them feel good or not so good. And
Mm.
knowing now that we do that the hypnotic trance is happening for the person, it's sort of like a campaign now I'm on to let EMTs, emergency room nurses and paramedics know that, sometimes this is this is happening within the first hour or so of the emergency. And now that we know that, can talk to them differently. It's not like we're being hypnotherapists ourselves, but we have identified that this is a phenomenon that's happening. And because it is, it's nice to be able to use that to our benefit. And in our book, we talk about one of the great benefits being that, you know, as healthcare providers, we say that it's time for us to be able to deliver positive, helpful, hopeful messages to our patients. And so many times, especially in emergency medicine, that's really not done. And
Mm.
and so just the act of thinking, just the provider thinking about, okay, I need to build rapport with this person. I need to protect this person from negative outside influences right now because of what's going on. And then I don't know, you as a paramedic have probably experienced this, asking a patient an open-ended question is normally, what we start out doing, but open-ended questions are really bad for folks who are in this state of mind. So, if I say, "Do you have any medical problems?" Well, that's they may not answer that question correctly for me
Yeah.
because I can't. So there are just knowing this really does do a lot because the reason I keep saying things like hypnosis is real is because I had to get into the nitty gritty of all this to start to believe it. I went back and read hypnosis and medical journals back through the 1940s, and I read over 250 books and journal articles looking at the subject. And one of the things that stood out to me, because as another person who has skepticism, I needed to understand it in a deep way. And what I found was that hypnosis does cause an actual change in the brain when it's occurring. And so they have PET scans that have been done, that we talk about them in our book. And a PET scan, PET, what that does is it's a scan. A lot of times they use for cancer, and they're able to identify really specific areas. And in this case, they see and notice that glucose is being used by the brain in a certain way. And so that lights up for them in these studies. And so the patient is able to be not hypnotized, brain scan versus hypnotized with a completely different thing. And then those patterns are all matching up. So, it's pretty easy to see that there is something real going on. And so with our patients that are going through this hypnotic, going through this emergency, this hypnotic state is good to be realized.
So what you're saying is when somebody's in this life-threatening situation or intense medical emergency, that they're more susceptible to being hypnotized, or they are, in this state of hypnosis. And then following that or kind of into that, is is this the shock that we see people when they're in and we say, that person's in shock. Is this the same state that you're talking about?
So I'll answer it backwards.
Okay.
A lot of times when I have a patient who's in medical shock, they're also experiencing the psychological shock at the same time. So that look that you see is sort of the both things are happening. And I differentiate them to say that what we're talking about is a sort of a psychological shock that may or
Mhm.
may not accompany the physical shock, and so the best way that I look at this, and I know that I'm not suggesting that we're putting anyone into any kind of hypnosis state,
Mhm.
but this is we're suggesting that because of what's going on, that this person is vulnerable to slipping into a trance themselves. So I'm
Okay.
saying that the paramedic, the EMT, the lifeguard, the doctor, they're not doing anything. They're just there with them, and this person is already in the spot. And so, of course, if you were a professional hypnotherapist and paramedic or something like that, of course you could put anyone, you could help anyone move into a deeper state of trance or do those kinds of advanced things. But our our book is just talking about the fact that this is something that's happening, and because it's
Right.
happening, gosh,
So it's a natural
we should do
phenomenon.
something like yeah, and it's really based on fear and vulnerability. And
Mhm.
I Forehand was my co-author, and I talk about how it just reminds us of horses because, if you're around a horse and you spook it, the horse, they just have an overwhelming fear that makes them lose their dang mind. They're not there, and they're just susceptible to that. So, like, I pay attention to how I act around the horse because I know that if I make a fast move, that they would be spooked. So it's sort of similar to that. But when we think about, you know, um, all of the elements being right for this to happen, they're definitely there. And I don't want to say that we can say that there's a certain I don't know what percentage of my patients are or might not be in a state. And that's why I treat them all like they are. And what's cool is that what we talk about in the book and what I like to talk about for how we help patients using these communication techniques, it's really nothing new in medicine. Like, we're not saying that anything should be done differently for first aid or CPR, or we're only saying that, gosh, the things that come out of your mouth really matter. And
Mhm.
so I don't know about you, but I've been in situations where, people have been basically interrogated forcefully because, you're so worried about this patient and you want to know all these answers as fast as you can. And, it's not pleasant. And understanding how we can take advantage of this differently just opens us up to being able to think about how we can be more successful. So that means we can hopefully get a better patient interview to figure out what's going on better. And then ultimately, at the very least, I would say there's a spectrum. At the very least, we would think or hope that the positive communication would help the patient feel better. And then at the other end of the spectrum, maybe we could see healing properties from this, right? Once we have the mind body connection, then there are certain ways to think about that. And that's why our book sets up different ways to think about how to talk to someone who has a severe burn or versus difficulty breathing. And it's nice to have a way to think about how to be positive and talk to somebody in a positive way during a moment that's just, it's the worst thing for them.
So when you're talking about, how we're considering the state that the patients are in, what does communication look like? How is it different to what someone is doing who's not aware, or, a new paramedic who, what should training look like in that communication setting?
So right now we have sort of like training that happens where we're trained on how to maybe first connect with the person, right? So right now, I think that we talk a lot about asking open-ended questions, and sometimes that's helpful. But when we know that the patient may be in a trance, then asking big open-ended questions might not help, us get to the right answer right away. So that's one change, or at least consideration. And the other consideration is this how we're talking to people. There's I think I'm on this campaign in part because I think that in emergency healthcare we can do a lot better with talking to our patients with positive messages of healing and respect. And I think that we get caught up so much in task oriented things. Like, as a paramedic, I know that I want to do all this list of things and I want to do it as fast as possible. But at the same time, there,
There's a human on the other end of that list.
yeah, for sure, there's a human there. And what if that's my family member? I want to be the same. I want to be that kind of paramedic that I'm taking care of them exactly like I would, my family. And so, for that to happen, we really have to think about how we talk. And right now, I wouldn't be bringing it up in this way if it wasn't severe. Sometimes, imagine someone that's very near death and the people around them talking and acting as if they are not there as a person. So yes, sometimes these patients can become science projects, and I don't know, I don't know how else to put it. And so, in some ways, we do dehumanize to protect ourselves as providers, but to absolutely not take it into consideration, I think is wrong. And to the point where I think that doing the opposite can change everything for somebody.
Yeah.
And
And,
it's
do you
incredible.
think, in my experience, and I'm not saying this is across the board, but I've found that the dehumanizing of patients, or pretending they're not there, I see that a lot in paramedics who have been in the role a really long time.
Yeah.
And, they're burnt out. They're
Mhm.
they're kinda over it. They're not getting the help they need, the mental health support that paramedics so desperately need. And so they're frustrated, they're, annoyed that patients aren't listening, like you say, "You need to go to the hospital. Why are you refusing right now?" So there's an aspect of that too, I think, that it's yes, you know, perhaps we do need to be approaching these patients differently, but also helping the paramedics so they don't reach this stage of annoyance with patients. Would you say that you kinda see the same? Is it similar? I know you're in the States. I've worked
So
in Canada.
yeah, and there's so much to say about that topic because yes, I think it's really common for paramedics to go through this process where you start out as a happy EMT and you end up as going through, and 4 years later you're a burned out paramedic who doesn't care as much. And part of the not caring has to do with the burnout, and part of it has to do with seeing so much of the trauma. And I think that the answer to all, I think it is happening everywhere. And I wrote about in GEMS this last month about a research study from Canada that talked about how I believe the number was 40% of paramedics that were surveyed had either thought about or attempted suicide.
Mhm.
And that's crazy numbers to think about. And so the mental health aspect um, is just now coming to the forefront. And the reason that it's coming to the forefront is because we're just not able to keep as many EMTs and paramedics in the job field on the street. They they thought that it had to do with money, and so in some places they started to correct the money to bring the money to be a more reasonable level. But then by then they found that there's no one left to even, pay to do these jobs. And so once it became across the country, it's become hard to recruit and find people to do that, to be in this field. And so that's what sounded the alarms. So right now, there's a lot of focus that's happening in the world of mental health towards first responders, and it's because it has already happened. That
Yeah.
and COVID really tipped things over the edge to be where we have to have a new concern. The other thing is that there's a generational change that's happened that I've seen in my 25 years, where when I started, there are lots of words for toxic masculinity, but I'll just use that one because it's the easiest one. But 25 years ago, there was a lot of masculine like overtones in the field to the point where people would get hurt on the job because they wouldn't want to be considered tough enough. Like for example, instead of asking for help to lift a heavy patient, they might hurt their back because they went ahead and did it, even though they like just pushing the line. And some of that has gone away with this new generation. And this is just an observation. I think that just like how bullies in schools are a little less put up with nowadays, in similar ways, I think that the respect for mental health and those considerations are changing. And a lot of myself included, I had PTSD because of a super severe mess that happened on the job with one of my patients. It's really hard to avoid from my perspective. I think if you're going to be a paramedic and work 911 for a long, long time, that it's just bound to happen that your brain, can't keep putting up shields forever. And one of the one of the counselors that I talked to about this once, let me know, and it really made a lot of sense to me that the paramedics that get, like myself, who get PTSD are a lot of times getting this because they care so much. And so because you care about the person, about the situation, about what's going on so much that it causes a deep wound, you know? And so, that mental wound for me caused me to have flashbacks and moodiness. And I was at the top of my career as a paramedic. I was a paramedic supervisor in a system and loved my job more than anything. But I basically went to mental breakdown over this nonstop protruding thoughts. You can't stop. It's just really difficult to make it through your day when you can't stop thinking about, the worst thing you can ever imagine. And so I got fixed basically through medicine. Medicine was awesome for me. So I'm like happy to say that it wasn't that hard of a road for me once I figured out how to fix me, because some people it's counseling, other folks it's medicine. And I I think it just sucks that it's unavoidable. But when you think about it, if you have a soldier who has been a soldier all their life, of course you're going to expect that they're going to have PTSD, right?
Into just, the lack of, support, the lack, there's no really talking about what you saw on the job, aside from your partner, but they're, going through the same thing. So, and I mean your partner in the field, because you don't necessarily come home and work and share all those details with your partners at home, because it's just too much.
Right.
And just goes back to that, mental health and getting them the support that they need.
Just to like put a point on what you said, here was my experience that just blew my mind with it. Okay, so I went to a counselor. I went to two, three I don't know. I was on a real journey to fix myself because I was having problems. Right. So, and I'm a health provider, so I'm like, oh, I'm bleeding, so fix it. Like I'm going to be aggressively to fix this. So that's what I did. One of the counselors that I talked to, I disclosed the story of what happened to me to cause me to have this PTSD, and it involved a patient that was a baby, and it was very traumatic. And I don't know what to say other than it was so super severe that when I told this full story to the counselor, who was a man, by the way, he cried. I don't mean a little cry. I mean, he fully teared up and cried. And so I'm like, okay, so let me tell you, I'm coming to a professional counselor. And yes, I just disclosed the story to you. This is what we're supposed to do here. This is why we're here. And now you can't even take it. I was like, are you kidding? Like, this is just beyond, And so, yeah, some of the stuff that people, can experience is really bad. And it's not the things that are so painful really, just to throw this out there, are just the human connection parts. You know, it's not like it's a horrible wound or anything. It's those human connection parts, and it's like it's really difficult because if somebody asks me the question is like, "Oh, what's the worst thing you see?" Or, "What oh, you're a paramedic, guys, it must be awful. What do what I tell them is I tell them like a half truth. I say the worst thing about the job is having to deal with decomposing dead bodies. And it's true because it's horrible. It's stinky, and really, really bad. And I could tell stories about that too. But sometimes we have to, be the one that finds the body or documents the body or whatever. And so it can be super bad. So I'd sort of throw that out there to put a sort of a different angle on the person's mind that asked me the question. But the real answer is one that would make even a professional counselor cry to hear the answer to. So dang if this stuff, can't get, pretty
I think
serious.
people, because you get that question a lot, and I find children love to ask that question. What was exciting about work? What's the worst thing you've seen? And I don't think they realize that this isn't like seeing something in a movie. This was a human that you've been with, you may have talked to, you've handled, you've helped care for, you've consoled family members. It wasn't just you and the patient. There were children or spouses around. And I think that people, when they ask that question, they don't think about that. They don't think, "Hey, and you know what? I don't really wanna relive it right now in this social setting. I
Yeah.
don't want to go back to that place because I'm already having nightmares or going to counseling, this is not the sort of question that you need to be asking me." I think they view it as a film and, what's the most exciting thing that you've seen, and it's absolutely not that.
Yeah, and it's really those human connection parts, it's like
Mm.
I remember this one time I took care of this lady who when I got to her, she was purple, barely not really breathing. And so I assisted her breathing and found out that she was on an LVAD, which is a left ventricular assist device. It's this device that they stick in your heart that has a battery pack you have to carry around with you. That's basically a last ditch effort to have something left of the heart to be able to, make it through to a transplant. I mean, it's very last, ditch resort kind of machinery. But she happened to be at home, and her husband, they called me. I was in charge of hers. She died a couple of times on me during that interaction, that time. All I kept thinking about was the interaction that I had between me and her husband, because by then I knew that she doesn't long for this world, but I had enough interaction with her husband to understand that he'd given up everything in his life, every dime he could, to pay for her medical treatment, to get her just another day, another moment, another anything. And so I promised him that I would do my very best, that I would take care of her. And so it's like, those things matter because it haunted me. I was like, even during the call, like I'm cussing at myself because I'm thinking, I made a promise to her husband that I would do my best. And I did. And, and believe it or not, she lived. Oh my gosh, she lived. But it took everything out of me. I don't know how long you can live on those kinds of things, but those personal connections that we can make, what that did is it gave him full confidence, that she was going to be well taken care of. And at the same time, it gave me full open vulnerability to get a wound because we made this personal connection. So those are the moments that can make things difficult because we're kind of used to seeing body parts and blood and those kinds of things. It's like it's like when it's personal, So
Absolutely. Now, we did go off on a bit of a tangent, and I said that I wouldn't let us, but we've kind of, gone into which, and it's very important, the mental health of paramedics and the lack of support that they get. So, definitely an important topic, but I'd love to get us back to the hypnosis side of things and your research. I'm very keen. So, I guess what I want to know now is the research that you're doing, is it around this hypnotic state, or is there any kind of case studies being done, or what's happening now that you've found this, phenomena, what's happening with it?
we have put together basically a book that explains the research and the application and gives suggestions on how we now can, going forward, interact with patients. And so the way it's set up is that we spend time talking through some of these steps of consideration. And one of them is just building rapport. And so the word credible is what we use in our book. So each letter stands for a different thing in the mnemonic, CREDIBLE. And I think the first one is confidence is the first one. I think that's one of the first chapters. And then after confidence is rapport. There's all these considerations, but one of the most important ones is rapport because we want to set the stage up from the start, and the nonverbal communication things that we do, how we interact, all of those things matter. And I don't know about you, but I want my patient to know that I care, that I'm their team member. I'm here to help them get through this, and those are the kinds of things that I'm gonna push for. There's some specific things that we tell paramedics that and EMTs and to think about. One is that, we want to maybe think about protecting the patient from negative communication. If you think about a child that has gotten bitten by a dog, then it makes sense that the interaction, the communication, what happens within that first hour of them getting bit by a dog, that might mean the difference between them being, having dogs as a grown up or being phobic of dogs, right? So these these positive messages to get through these situations are important. And so protecting what they hear, delivering positive messages, and focusing on that rapport and teamwork. One of the things that's most commonly misunderstood about hypnosis is that hypnosis is not a mind control trick. There's my understanding is that the CIA here in the US did some research studies, and even some of those were in Canada as well, that try to really use hypnosis as one of the mind control things. And they found they can't do it. They just can't do it. And actual hypnosis requires a partnership between the person and the person that's working with them. If
Just on that
you're,
note, I had
yeah,
a hypnotherapist on the show, and that episode is now published if anybody'd like to go look at it. But the way she was explaining it to me, and she did a little bit of hypnotherapy with me actually in the episode while we were recording, and she said, it's absolutely not mind control. She said, I'm not going to be able to make you go and do something that you don't want to do. It's just not going to happen. You're right. That I mean, this is what she said. She's agrees with what you've just said. Now it's you have to kind of not necessarily want to do it, but it has to be something that you would kind of naturally do or be okay with doing. And it has to be a partnership. You have to be willing to participate. And it's just, yeah, she used the example of, I'm not going to be able to get you to go out and rob a store or hurt someone. So, yeah, I think it's really important for people to kind of recognize that because despite how much more coming up in popularity hypnosis is in a complementary medical setting, people do still kind of think it's, they're just going to make you do all these funny things or ridiculous things or bad things. So yeah, I'm glad that you pointed that out.
yeah. And so that's one of the things that I've done in my research is, and when I say research in this respect, I'm saying in my reading and working to figure this out. What's going on with the stage hypnosis is that they are choosing willing participants. And usually those folks are already sort of predisposed to hypnosis anyway. They want to do it. And then if you notice, after the first round of them trying the hypnosis stuff, they ship the people who aren't responding correctly off stage real quick in a hurry. And so they basically are picking the low hanging fruit of the audience, that would be most susceptible to being, to do the most. And it's sort of just for, a different reason. And they may not do any kind of work to help them move into that trance. But the kind of trance I talk about is completely different. And the other thing that's kind of interesting about this that I like to talk about with hypnosis is a guy by the name of James Tripp. His last name's Tripp. And he's from the UK and he's a famous hypnotherapist there. And he does some stage work. So he does, some hypnosis stuff on stage. He wrote a book that was called Hypnosis Without Trance. His book really talks about how to use regular conversation towards hypnosis. So he suggests that he can help someone move into hypnosis just by having a regular conversation with them and sort of pull them into that. And I just liked it a lot because I think that if you're interested in hypnosis, that's a good way to start is to think about how you talk to one another. And a lot of the way that he talks about interacting with people through just conversational hypnosis is akin to how we as health providers during this first hour or so also need to think about communicating with them. So they matched up really well. But folks that are interested in hypnosis, I suggest to check out James Tripp. And there is like a full gamut of stuff on hypnosis. And I would say that that some stuff is just sensationalized and some stuff is just not true. And it's so unfortunate that our mental health went off the rails at one point. And I think that a lot of people would say that there was, and those kinds of experimental things that were done that really, once they were disclosed to the public, did not sit well with the public, and understandably so. And as a result, there's been a lot of doubt. But in some ways, I feel religious. I feel like I'm here to spread the joy. You can talk to your patients about happiness, about feeling good, but there's good reason for it because it can make a real change, especially people that are in these really horrible moments. I've had times where I sit in the ambulance when we're riding down the road, and I literally have a decision to make. I could talk to them or I could not talk to them. So now that I
Absolutely.
have
I
a
mean, you get
direction.
to you kind of determine the paramedic, that's in the back with the patient gets to determine the experience that they have. And, they're in the back of an ambulance. It's already a pretty shitty situation.
Yeah.
So you really just do your best to make that person, will keep them alive, make them comfortable, but also make them okay and happy, as happy as they can be. But what I'm trying to say is don't make it worse. Don't be the reason that person is having a worse day than they're already having. I think that's a really valid point. And I like that I like this research that you're doing, and I hope that it brings some sort of, I guess, change to the way paramedics are maybe taught initially, depending on what they're getting taught. I mean, now it's been a while since I've been in school, or even just retraining and reminders of this is actually how we should be managing these patients while they're in our care.
Well, I think that there's always going to be some kind of doubt or strangeness associated with this until we until folks understand that we're not asking you to be a hypnotherapist. We're just letting you know, hey, by the way, this is a consideration because more than likely your patient is in a trance. And just having that realization, there's so many people that have read my book and came back to me and said, I see my patient's totally different now. They may not even do anything that I suggest in the book, but they notice that this vulnerability and this shock and fear and all can easily culminate into this emergency psychological moment, and it's good to be positioned to be the person that guides them, through that in a positive way. I get into a lot of patterns with the calls that I do, and I found that, once I get a regular pattern down, that it's really easy to think about, ways to incorporate this because we in our book don't think that we should be doing really anything different than modern medicine. It's just that it's how we talk to people. And, there's have been really good people that have talked about exactly what we're talking about already. And there's authors, Judith Prager and Judith Acosta wrote a book that was called The Worst Is Over. And The Worst Is Over was a book that was about using these exact same techniques. And it was based on the same initial research that our book was based on, which is there was a physician that was in Kansas in the late 70s who did experiments asking paramedics on two different teams. One team would do everything normal, that nothing changed. And the other team, paramedics or EMTs, would follow a specific regimen of protecting the patient from negative interactions from the bystanders or family, try to protect them from anything negative hearing. And in addition to just regular positive messaging, Dr. Wright's team read this statement to each of their patients. And the statement, it was just a calming, reassuring statement. So after they'd already developed rapport, already done emergency interventions, they would just read from this card. And it would be some small statement like this. It would be like, I want you to know that the worst is over now. And since I've been here, we've looked to be a partner to fix all of this stuff. And things are looking up for you. From here out, we'll be riding to the hospital and they already know that you're coming. So the worst is over. Everything is better from here. So just it wasn't those exact words. And when I'm with my emergency patients, I do a statement sort of similar to that. Or I was just trying to think of all the different things that we would normally like to inject. But you know, having a patient that trusts you, that now has this confidence that, okay, I'm good, it just can mean the world to the situation. I mean, forget hypnosis, it's just it can make a big difference. And so it's all about the power of words and what they can do. And
They're
as a
very powerful.
for sure, for sure.
Mhm.
And I think it matters just how all this can come together for people. So I'm excited that you're here to talk to me about it.
No, and I think it's been great having you on the show. And I just want to point anyone who is listening and who would like to kind of learn more about what hypnosis is. In the other episode, we do get into what it is. And I know, Bram, that, you're not saying that paramedics are putting people in this trance, but I just want, because we've talked about it so much, I want people to go back and listen and understand what it is. Understand that it is not this mind control game. Anyone listening, have a listen to that episode. It goes in through some details, and then I want to read the title of your book again: Hypnotic Communication in Emergency Settings for Life Saving and Therapeutic Outcomes. So, where can anyone access this?
So you can just type in my name, or you could type in part of the name of the book and Google anywhere will find it. But the cool way to find anything is to go to my personal website, because you can find the research that I'm doing and you can see the podcast episodes that I'm on, and you can find the research that I have out there, including the book. And so that's it, going to professorbram.com. So it's professor BRAM.com. And the book's out by Routledge, so it's all over the world, available.
Awesome. So I'm actually going to link that as well to the show notes, if that's all right with you.
For sure.
And some of the other resources that we mentioned, some of the books, James Tripp and Judith Acosta, I'm going to link all that sort of stuff. So anyone who is interested while we were talking, head to the show notes or the description underneath this video, and you'll find all of that. Ram, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really happy that we were able to work out the time difference. And yeah, thank you for what you're doing. It's wonderful, and it's going to benefit a lot of patients. I'm confident of that.
Well, thank you, and thanks to my listeners.
Thanks, Bram. We'll see you next time. Thanks for joining me on the Holistic Health Show. If you enjoyed the episode, subscribe now and get ready to embark on an incredible journey toward holistic wellness. Until next time, be well and stay holistic.